In the marble-clad amphitheaters of American power, some days are merely procedural, a slow grinding of the legislative gears. Others, however, become legend. They are the days when the carefully constructed facades of Washington, D.C. are ripped away, exposing the raw, brutal nature of political combat. This was one of those days. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room was not merely a room, it was an arena, charged with the electric hum of impending conflict. The air was thick with a mixture of expensive perfume, cheap coffee, and palpable animosity. What had been billed as a mundane joint hearing on intelligence community reform had, through whispered back-channel threats and media hype, morphed into a gladiatorial spectacle. The mob was here for blood. At the center of it all were two men who might as well have been from different planets, embodying the fractured soul of a nation. On one side sat Congressman Adam Schiff of California, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. He was the very picture of coastal establishment power. His Armani suit was a shield of dark, immaculate wool, his California tan a testament to a life lived far from the worries of the common man. He moved not with the caution of a legislator but with the predatory grace of a prosecutor who believes he is not only the lawyer and the judge but also the executioner. He arrived not alone, but with a Praetorian guard of 3 lawyers, 5 staffers, and 2 heavy boxes of documents, each one organized to inflict maximum political pain. He was a man who saw politics not as the art of the possible, but as a zero-sum war to be won by any means necessary. And on the other side, slouched slightly in his chair, was Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana. If Schiff was a creature of the swamp in Washington, Kennedy was a product of the swamps back home. He arrived alone, carrying a single, battered leather briefcase that looked as if it had absorbed the humidity and stories of 1,000 Louisiana courtrooms. His suit was serviceable. His white hair looked like it had been combed with a towel. And his demeanor was that of a man who'd much rather be fishing for crawdads on the bayou. To the flock of liberal media vultures gathered in the press section, he was a caricature come to life, the folksy, slow-talking Southern Republican, a relic to be mocked and then politically destroyed. They had their headlines pre-written, their narratives set. Today, the slick, brilliant Californian would intellectually vivisect the bumbling hick from the South. Schiff, ever the aggressor, began the proceedings with a theatrical flourish of contempt. His voice, dripping with the condescending cadence of academic elitism, cut through the room. "Senator Kennedy," he began, placing a derisive emphasis on the title, as if it were an ill-fitting costume. "Your voting record shows a consistent, almost pathological opposition to intelligence community reforms. You've slurred dedicated public servants as deep state operatives. You've enabled a president who has systematically attacked our most vital institutions. Frankly," he paused, scanning the room to make sure every camera was on him, "your *backward Southern politics* have no place in any serious discussion about the security of this nation." He wasn't finished. Seeing Kennedy listening quietly, polishing his glasses with a worn handkerchief, Schiff mistook silence for weakness and pressed his attack. "Maybe if you spent less time conjuring up those quaint, folksy sayings and more time actually reading intelligence reports, assuming you can even comprehend them, you'd realize just how dangerously out of your depth you are." A few of his Democratic colleagues chuckled on cue. The media typed furiously, capturing the kill shot. Schiff smirked, delivering what he thought would be the final, dismissive blow. "In that accent," he said with a sneer, "perhaps you could try to speak a bit faster. Some of us have actual, important work to do today." The trap had been set. The caricature had been painted. The audience was ready for the humiliation. But as John Kennedy slowly leaned toward his microphone, a small, knowing smile played on his lips. The hunter was about to discover that he had cornered the wrong animal. The slow, thick drawl that Schiff had mocked filled the room, not with the sound of surrender, but with the quiet thunder of a coming storm. "Well, now, Congressman Schiff," Kennedy began, his voice as smooth and unhurried as molasses in winter, "I surely do appreciate your concern for my speaking pace and my education. I may sound like Foghorn Leghorn, but at least I don't lie like Pinocchio." The room, which moments before had been filled with the smug chuckles of Schiff's allies, suddenly fell silent. The air crackled. A few reporters who had been looking down at their phones glanced up. A flicker of confusion and then intrigue in their eyes. The Pinocchio line was not just a witty comeback, it was a declaration of war. Delivered with the serene confidence of a man who knew he held all the high cards. Schiff's face, which had been a mask of condescending amusement, tightened. A slight flush of red crept up his neck. "You see," Kennedy continued, his voice maintaining its unhurried, almost conversational rhythm, "where I come from, we have a simple saying, don't start none, won't be none. It's a piece of advice that's kept a lot of folks out of a world of trouble." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air like the humid Louisiana fog. "But since you seem so determined to make my education the topic of this hearing, I suppose it's only polite that I oblige you." He adjusted his glasses, peering over the rims at Schiff like a professor about to correct a particularly dim-witted student. "My mama taught me that when someone calls you ignorant, the best thing to do is to educate them. So consider this, Congressman. Class is in session. And for you, tuition is free." The atmosphere had shifted entirely. This was no longer a slaughter, it was a duel. And one of the duelists had just revealed he was armed with more than just folksy aphorisms. "I'll admit," Kennedy said with a self-deprecating nod, "I had to muddle my way through a few schools. First, there was Vanderbilt University. Then I struggled through the University of Virginia School of Law." He paused, letting the names of two of the South's most prestigious institutions settle in the room. He looked up at the ceiling as if trying to recall a distant memory. "And what was that other little place?" "Oh, yes, Magdalen College, at Oxford University." He looked directly at Schiff, his eyes sharp and clear. "As in England, as in a Rhodes Scholar." If a bomb had gone off, the effect would have been less stunning. The quiet laughter from the Democratic side of the aisle died instantly, replaced by a collective, sharp intake of breath. The media scribes stopped typing mid-sentence, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning realization. They had been sold a narrative, and it had just been publicly, spectacularly incinerated. The ignorant Southern puppet was a Rhodes Scholar from Oxford. Adam Schiff blinked rapidly, his brain seeming to short-circuit as it tried to process this new, paradigm-shattering information. The foundation of his entire attack had just crumbled to dust. But Kennedy was just getting started. He reached down with a deliberate slowness into that worn-out leather briefcase. The entire room seemed to lean forward, captivated by the movement. He didn't pull out a sheaf of talking points or an intelligence report. He produced a single, professionally bound document. "In fact, Congressman, I've been doing some reading myself lately," Kennedy said, holding up the document so the cameras could see the cover. "This here is a copy of your Harvard law thesis. A fine piece of work. The title is, Prosecutorial Ethics in the Modern Justice System. Fascinating stuff." He opened the document, his finger tracing a line on a page he had clearly marked beforehand. "Page 47 is particularly interesting. I found myself nodding along as I read it." He adjusted his glasses again and began to read, his Louisiana drawl lending a strange, almost biblical authority to the words. "A prosecutor who manipulates evidence or misleads the court betrays not just his office, but the very foundation of justice itself." He looked up from the page, his gaze locking onto Schiff's. He let the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment, allowing the weight of Schiff's own words to suffocate him. "Your words, Congressman," Kennedy said, his voice dropping to an almost whisper. "Shall we discuss how well you've lived up to them?" Adam Schiff sat frozen, a man caught in the blinding glare of an oncoming train. The confident smirk had not just vanished, it had been replaced by a pallid, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. The armor of his condescension had been pierced and shattered by a single, perfectly aimed volley of truth. His legal team, moments before relaxed and confident, were now whispering urgently amongst themselves, their panicked motions a frantic ballet of an ambush gone horribly wrong. The entire power dynamic of the room had been inverted. The hearing was no longer Schiff's stage, it had become Kennedy's courtroom. And he had just unmasked the defendant. "Now, you mentioned I don't understand complex legal matters," Kennedy continued, the folksy drawl now sounding less like a regional quirk and more like the calm, measured tone of a master prosecutor laying out his case. "So let me see if I can struggle through this. You also challenged my knowledge of California law. Well, let's see." He didn't consult a note. He didn't ask an aide. He spoke from memory, his voice steady. California Evidence Code Section 1040. Subsection B states that a public entity has a privilege to refuse disclosure of official information if disclosure is against the public interest. A statute you, in your capacity on the Intelligence Committee, violated exactly 17 times. He then proceeded to rattle off the specific dates and violations. A torrent of factual detail that left no room for argument. But I'm just a simple country lawyer, he added, the theatrical modesty now dripping with delicious irony. What would I know about the legal codes of all 50 states that I happen to have memorized for fun? The press section was a study in whiplash. The narrative they had come to document, the humiliation of a backward Republican, was dead. In its place was a story far more compelling. The public vivisection of one of the most powerful Democrats in America. Conducted by his intended victim. But the thesis and the legal statutes were merely the overture. The true symphony of destruction was still waiting in the wings. Residing inside that battered leather briefcase. Kennedy reached into it again. This time, he didn't pull out a single document. He pulled out a folder. Then another. And another. He began to place them on the desk in front of him. One by one, with the deliberate care of a demolition expert planting charges. They were not a haphazard pile, they were a neat, ominous stack, an arsenal of paper and truth. And on the tab of each folder, a label was clearly visible to the cameras. Each one a chapter in the indictment he was about to read. Russia hoax, whistleblower coordination, illegal leaks, China connections, Ed Buck scandal. The list went on, a litany of malfeasance laid bare for the world to see. This was the moment the hearing transformed from a political squabble into a public prosecution. The physical presence of those folders was a masterstroke of political theater. They were tangible, heavy, and undeniable. They represented years of meticulous research. A mountain of evidence that made Schiff's 2 boxes of organized talking points look like a child's craft project. Kennedy gestured to the stack. His new arsenal. Now, Congressman Schiff, he said, his voice taking on a harder, prosecutorial edge despite the unchanged drawl. You called me ignorant, backwards, and embarrassing. My mama taught me that when someone insults you like that, they're usually just describing themselves. So, let's test that theory, shall we? Before Schiff or his shell-shocked lawyers could respond, Kennedy added another layer to his performance. He pulled out his personal cell phone. But first, he said, holding it up, I want to show you something interesting. You see, while you were busy insulting my intelligence, the good folks back home in Louisiana were watching. And they seemed to have some thoughts. He turned the phone so the cameras could see the screen. His Twitter feed was exploding with messages of support. Simultaneously, Schiff's feed was being inundated with a single, burning question, repeated thousands of times. What's in the folders? Seems like those backwards folks you look down on understand something you don't. Congressman, Kennedy mused, they can smell what my cousin Boudreaux calls a possum in the woodpile from a mile away. And sir, with all due respect, you're stinking up the whole forest. The committee chairman, a Democrat who had expected an easy win for his party, shifted uncomfortably in his high-backed chair. Gentlemen, he interjected weakly, perhaps we should try to focus on the stated agenda. Oh, I am more than happy to focus on intelligence reform, Kennedy replied with a cheerful, almost beatific smile. Let's start by reforming the intelligence of certain committee members who wouldn't recognize the truth if it bit them on their Harvard-educated posterior. He turned his full attention back to the man across from him. The man who was now visibly sweating under the hot television lights. So, what'll it be, Congressman? Kennedy asked, gesturing to his stack of folders. The roadmap to Schiff's ruin. You want to keep talking about how ignorant I am? Or would you like to begin your education by discussing your career? Because I've got all day. And unlike some folks, I tell the truth, even when I'm talking slow. He reached for the first folder. The one that had started it all. Let's start with Russia, shall we? The rustle of the manila folder opening was the only sound in the cavernous room. It was a soft, unassuming noise, yet it carried the weight of a death sentence. Kennedy handled the folder not with haste, but with the theatrical deliberation of a man unveiling a masterpiece of damning evidence. He was no longer just a senator, he was a storyteller. And this was the first chapter of a tragedy in which Adam Schiff was both the author and the villain. Now, Congressman Schiff, Kennedy began, his voice a low, steady rumble. Let's talk about your famous quote. The one that echoed in every newsroom from coast to coast for 3 long years. The one where you looked the American people in the eye and swore you had more than circumstantial evidence of Russian collusion. He paused, letting the memory of that oft-repeated phrase hang in the air. That was quite a claim. Reminds me of my uncle Beauregard claiming he once caught a catfish the size of a John boat. Kennedy pulled a meticulously organized timeline chart from the folder. The difference is, he said, tapping the chart, Uncle Beauregard had a picture. You, sir, had nothing but hot air and a media establishment that was more than willing to print your fairy tales. He looked up, his gaze boring into Schiff. By my count, and I'm just a simple country lawyer. But I do know how to count. You lied to the American people about having evidence of Russian collusion exactly 237 times on national television. I know because I counted each one myself. Twice. And then I had my staff verify it 3 times. Just to be sure. Schiff, who had been shrinking in his chair, tried to rally. He straightened his tie and puffed out his chest. A reflexive act of a man whose authority was under siege. I always maintained that we had evidence, he declared, his voice attempting a firmness it could not achieve. Oh, that's a fascinating choice of words, Kennedy interjected, his tone deceptively mild. He reached into his briefcase and produced a small, silver digital recorder, placing it on the desk with a soft click. Because I have here a recording from a closed, top-secret session of your committee. The date was March 17, 2019. Would you like me to play it for the class? Schiff's lawyers, who had been trying to scribble notes, froze. One of them shot to his feet. Mr. Chairman, that's classified material. Kennedy offered a benign smile. Was classified, he corrected cheerfully. Declassified last month by the Director of National Intelligence. Funny how truth has a way of seeing daylight. Eventually, without another word, he pressed the play button. A voice filled the room, tinny, but unmistakably Adam Schiff's. It was the voice of a man speaking behind closed doors. A voice stripped of its public bravado. We don't have direct evidence of collusion yet, the recording of Schiff said. The word, yet, hanging with the faint hope of a desperate gambler. But I am confident we will find it if we just keep looking. Kennedy pressed the stop button, and the ensuing silence was deafening. No direct evidence, Kennedy repeated softly, letting the confession settle over the room. He then looked up, a glint in his eye. And yet, Congressman, on the very same night, not a week later, not a day later, but that very same night, you walked out of that secure room. Went straight to a CNN studio. And told Anderson Cooper that you had smoking gun evidence in your possession. He shook his head with a look of profound disappointment. Sir, that's like saying you've cooked up a world-class gumbo when all you've got is an empty pot and some wishful thinking. The press section, which had arrived to chronicle a takedown, was now furiously documenting one, just not the one they had been promised. Their expressions had shifted from smug anticipation to the grim focus of journalists who suddenly realized they were witnessing a real story. But wait, there's more, Kennedy said, his voice taking on the cadence of a late-night infomercial host. A touch of levity that only sharpened the brutality of his attack. Let me ask you something, Congressman, a simple question. Did you happen to know a fellow by the name of Dmitry Volkov? Schiff's face, which had been pale, seemed to drain of all remaining color, leaving a sickly, grayish pallor. I don't recall that name, he stammered, his eyes darting toward his lawyers as if searching for a lifeline. Let me refresh your memory, Kennedy offered, his voice dripping with helpfulness. Harvard Law School, class of 1985. Your roommate for 2 full years. Son of a high-ranking Russian diplomat. An interesting fellow, I'm sure. Currently a senior executive at a Russian state-owned energy company. Kennedy leaned forward, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. You spent years projecting your own Russian connections onto President Trump like an IMAX theater projecting the latest blockbuster. He then produced a photograph from the folder. It was a faded, grainy image of 2 young men in graduation robes, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, beaming at the camera. One was a young Adam Schiff, the other, presumably, was Dmitry Volkov. In Louisiana, we have a name for that. It's called psychological projection. It's like a thief who's convinced that everyone he meets is trying to pick his pocket. Kennedy placed the photo on the desk, letting the image of Schiff's own hidden Russian connection sear itself into the public record. Schiff tried to pivot, to grasp for any piece of procedural high ground. That meeting you played the recording from was classified. You just admitted to. Admitted to what? Kennedy asked with wide-eyed innocence. Playing a recording that has been fully declassified? But since you're so concerned with the sanctity of classified information, didn't you go on CNN that very night and discuss the details of that same supposedly classified meeting? He picked up a tablet and, with a few taps, played a CNN clip from the same date. There was Schiff, telling Anderson Cooper specifics that could only have come from the meeting he claimed was sacrosanct. Your memory, sir, is shorter than a politician's promise come election time, Kennedy observed dryly. Or maybe you just believe the rules that apply to everyone else don't apply to you. The final act of this chapter was perhaps the most devastating. Kennedy laid out two documents side by side on the desk, using a ruler to point at specific sections as if he were a schoolteacher instructing a particularly slow student. They were the infamous Nunes memo and Schiff's rebuttal memo. Now, the Nunes memo stated that the FISA warrant to spy on the Trump campaign was based on the unverified Steele dossier. You stood on this very floor and called that a dangerous lie. Turns out, Kennedy tapped the document. It was verified as true. The Nunes memo said the FBI didn't tell the FISA court that the Clinton campaign had paid for the dossier. You said that was a damnable falsehood. Turns out, true as the gospel. He went on, point by brutal point, demonstrating with irrefutable evidence that every key assertion in the Republican memo had been vindicated by subsequent Inspector General reports, while every denial and counter-assertion in Schiff's memo had been proven false. You're batting zero while claiming to be an all-star congressman. That's like my cousin Thibodeau claiming he's a NASCAR driver because he once drove his pickup truck fast to the Piggly Wiggly. He leaned back, letting the totality of the deception sink in. You crowed about Russia from every rooftop in Washington, every TV studio in New York. But your nest, sir, is emptier than a politician's soul. You didn't have evidence. You had a fantasy, and you sold it to the American people. That's not an investigation, Congressman. That's fiction writing. And frankly, your plots aren't very believable. He closed the Russia folder with a satisfied snap that echoed through the silent room. You know what the real tragedy is? He said, his voice turning somber. While you were off playing Captain Ahab, chasing your great white whale of Russian collusion, real threats to this nation went ignored. All because you were too busy trying to win a political game. He reached for the next folder. The one labeled, Whistleblower Scandal. But don't you worry, we are just getting started. Like my grandpappy used to say, when you drain the swamp, the biggest, meanest gators are always hiding at the bottom. And sir, he said, opening the next file, we're about to go deep-sea diving in your career. Kennedy opened the second folder with the meticulous care of a surgeon preparing for a complex and delicate operation. The mood in the room shifted again. The Russia chapter had been about lies and hypocrisy. The title on this new folder, Whistleblower Coordination, suggested something more sinister, an active conspiracy. Now, let's talk about your little whistleblower friend, Kennedy began, his tone now that of a detective laying out the timeline of a crime. You know, the one you swore you and your staff had no contact with. The one you definitely never met, never coordinated with, and certainly never coached. That whistleblower. He pulled out another large, detailed timeline, this one resembling a complex flowchart from a murder mystery board. Let's look at the dates, shall we? They tell a fascinating story. August 12, 2019. A member of your senior staff meets with the man who would later be identified as the whistleblower. August 12, 2019. The very same day, that same man, the whistleblower, officially files his complaint. Kennedy looked up from the chart, a folksy grin spreading across his face. Now, I'm not a betting man, Congressman, but if I were, I'd say the odds of that being a pure coincidence are longer than my Aunt Gertrude's Christmas grocery list. Schiff, who had been attempting to regain some semblance of composure, immediately stiffened. There was no coordination, he insisted, his voice thin and reedy. My staff acted appropriately. Hold on now, Kennedy interrupted, a mischievous glint in his eye. He reached for his phone again. I'm about to do something that might seem a little unconventional. The room went dead silent. The press leaned forward, their cameras focused intently on Kennedy's hands. I'm going to text the whistleblower's attorney right now. His number was, helpfully provided to my office by a concerned party. He held up the phone so everyone could see him type. Hey Mark, he said, narrating his text. It's Senator Kennedy. Quick question for your client. He says he never coordinated with Schiff's staff. Is that his final answer? Because we have some conflicting information. The theatricality was breathtaking. It was a high-stakes bluff. A piece of political performance art designed to provoke a reaction. The hearing room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Schiff's face was a canvas of pure panic. His lawyers were frantically whispering, one of them gesturing wildly for him to say nothing. Then, almost immediately, Kennedy's phone buzzed loudly on the desk. Well, would you look at that? Kennedy said, his eyes wide with feigned surprise as he picked up the phone. He turned the screen toward the cameras. The reply was visible to all. Which meeting are you referring to? There were several. The room erupted. The message on the screen was an atomic bomb. It wasn't just a confirmation of a meeting, it was a confirmation of multiple meetings. It directly contradicted everything Schiff had claimed for months. It was proof, not just of contact, but of a coordinated effort. Seems your whistleblower's recollection is a little different than yours. Congressman, Kennedy drawled, savoring the moment. Schiff looked as if he had been physically struck. He had walked into a perfectly laid trap, and the jaws had just snapped shut on live television. The chaos that Kennedy's text message gambit had unleashed was a smokescreen for his next, more concrete piece of evidence. As the chairman weakly hammered his gavel, calling for order, Kennedy calmly reached back into the folder. But a text message can be debated, I suppose. He conceded generously. So let's move on to something a little more photographic. He produced a large, glossy 8x10 photograph. This here was taken at a lovely restaurant in Georgetown called Café Milano. Very fancy place. $200 steaks. My constituents would call that a scandal in itself. He held the photo up for the cameras. And look who we have here. Having a cozy little dinner together on August 5, 2019. Just 1 week before the whistleblower complaint was officially filed. The photo was crystal clear. It showed Adam Schiff dining with a younger man, both leaning in conspiratorially over their meals. The younger man was the same individual whose face had been plastered across conservative media for months. Identified as the whistleblower. You coached your star witness on the most important lines of his testimony. Kennedy accused, his voice dropping the folksy charm and adopting a cold, prosecutorial fury. Then you feigned total surprise when he delivered them, acting more shocked than a raccoon in a garbage can when the lid slams shut. Sir, that's like a fireman who sets fires just so he can rush in and play the hero for putting them out. He wasn't done. He pulled out a transcript, handling it as if it were radioactive. But the real masterpiece of deception was your so-called parody of President Trump's phone call with the Ukrainian president. Let me refresh everyone's memory of your performance on the House floor. He signaled for an audio clip to be played. The hearing room was filled with the sound of Schiff's voice, reading his dramatic, fictionalized interpretation of the call, a version filled with mob boss language and threats that appeared nowhere in the actual transcript. When the clip ended, Kennedy produced the real, declassified transcript of the call. Now, let's compare your Hollywood script to the actual reality, he said. He read sections from both documents side by side. The contrast between Schiff's lurid invention and the mundane reality of the call proving devastatingly effective. You didn't just exaggerate, Congressman. You lied on national television. You made up quotes. You invented dialogue that never existed. In Louisiana, we call that fraud. In California, apparently, you call it parody. That's like calling a bank robbery an unauthorized withdrawal. The press gallery was a whirlwind of activity. This was no longer a political hearing, it was the systematic, evidence-based destruction of a public figure. But here, Kennedy said, his voice lowering with gravity, is where this story moves from unethical to truly corrupt. He pulled out a thick, bound report from the folder. You hid evidence. My investigation found that your committee took testimony from 17 witnesses, 17, whose accounts directly contradicted your public narrative. And you buried every single one of them. He began reading excerpts from the hidden testimonies, his voice ringing with indignation. From Ambassador Kurt Volker, I saw no evidence of a quid pro quo or any linkage between security assistance and political investigations. From Tim Morrison, a top NSC official, I want to be clear. I was not concerned that anything illegal was discussed. You hid these exonerating testimonies like a squirrel hides nuts for the winter. Kennedy thundered. Except a squirrel does it for survival. You did it for pure, naked political gain. Having thoroughly dismantled the foundation of the impeachment, Kennedy now turned his attention to the very structure of the process itself, framing it not as a constitutional remedy, but as a subversion of it. He held up the third folder. Its label stark and accusatory, impeachment coup. He shook his head with a display of theatrical sorrow. You know, he mused, when I was a boy in Louisiana, we'd sometimes play hide and seek in my grandpappy's old barn. But even as children, we understood a fundamental rule. You couldn't just make up new rules in the middle of the game to ensure you'd win. Apparently, that's a lesson they don't teach at Harvard Law. He pulled out a detailed floor plan of the Capitol building. Using a laser pointer that seemed to appear from nowhere, he circled a section in the basement. This here is the SCIF, the Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. A place designed for the solemn duty of reviewing our nation's most sensitive secrets. But you, Congressman, you turned it into your own personal star chamber. You ran your impeachment inquiry from this basement bunker like a Bond villain. Except most Bond villains have better, more coherent plans. He pointed to specific rooms on the diagram. Behind these closed doors, you held your secret trials. You denied the president, the accused, the fundamental right to have his counsel present. You denied Republican members of Congress their right to participate. You coached witnesses in private and then selectively leaked cherry-picked portions of their testimony to your allies in the media. A Republican congressman from Ohio, unable to contain himself, shouted, "He's right, they locked us out. My constituents were denied representation." The chairman's call for order was lost in the swell of agreement. But the witness coaching wasn't just a suspicion. Kennedy continued, pulling out a tablet. I've got something special for the committee today. A video deposition that came into my office just this morning from a man who wants to clear his conscience. He pressed play. The face of William Taylor, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and Schiff's star witness, appeared on the screens around the room. He looked uncomfortable, but resolute. My name is William Taylor, he began, his voice steady. I testified during the impeachment hearings. I need to state for the record that my testimony was heavily influenced by the staff of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman Schiff's staff coached me extensively. They provided me with specific phrases and narratives to use. When I expressed concerns that certain characterizations were not entirely accurate, I was told that the broader truth of the narrative was more important than the literal truth of the facts. It was made clear to me that my career would be over if I did not comply. The hearing room exploded. The raw, on-camera confession from the prosecution's own key witness was an act of political immolation. Schiff's remaining lawyers were in full-blown panic. That's been doctored. It's edited. Schiff protested desperately, his voice cracking. Has it now? Kennedy asked mildly. Well, that's good news, because Ambassador Taylor is currently in a holding room down the hall. And he has agreed to come here and repeat all of this. Under oath, in public, unlike your secret basement trials. Kennedy then did something that seemed to stop time. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn, pocket-sized copy of the U.S. Constitution. Holding it aloft, pop quiz. Congressman, he said, Article 2, Section 4. It outlines the grounds for impeachment. What are they? No Googling. Now, I know that's your first instinct when you're looking for facts. Schiff glared but began to recite mechanically. The president shall be removed from office on impeachment for, and conviction of, treason, bribery. Stop right there, Kennedy commanded. Treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, show me the part where it says, hurt feelings, or, mean tweets, or, Adam Schiff really doesn't like the guy. You didn't just bend the rules of procedure. Sir, you took a sacred constitutional duty, a tool meant as a shield to protect the republic, And you hammered it into a political sword to slay your enemies. You turned due process into don't process. The Founding Fathers warned us about men like you. He closed the impeachment folder with a final, contemptuous flick of his wrist. Stalin would have been proud of your show trials. Congressman. At least he was honest about being a tyrant. A palpable darkness fell over the room as Kennedy reached for the next folder. The previous sections, while devastating, had existed in the familiar realm of political combat, lies, leaks, and procedural abuses, but the label on this folder, Ed Buck Scandal, signaled a descent into something far more depraved. Kennedy's demeanor changed. The theatricality vanished, replaced by cold, quiet disgust. Now this folder here, he said, his Louisiana draw thick with revulsion, requires a strong stomach. This isn't about partisan games. This is about your donor, Ed Buck, and some of the other unsavory characters from your California district. A fair warning to anyone with a weak constitution. He opened it slowly, and the first thing he revealed was a photograph. Several people in the gallery gasped audibly. It was the face of a smiling, older white man next to the logo for Adam Schiff's congressional campaign. "This is Ed Buck," Kennedy said, his voice flat and hard. "A major Democratic donor. A very generous donor to your campaigns. Congressman, he gave you over $500,000 over the years." He paused, letting the name and the amount hang in the air before delivering the sickening context. Mr. Buck also had a disturbing habit. Young, black, gay men had a habit of dying from drug overdoses in his West Hollywood apartment. 2 of them, to be exact. Kennedy's voice had lost all trace of humor. This was no longer politics. It was an epitaph. Gemmill Moore, 26 years old, Kennedy said, placing a photo of a young, smiling black man on the desk. Found dead in Mr. Buck's apartment in 2017. The coroner ruled it an accidental methamphetamine overdose. Timothy Dean, 55 years old, he continued, placing another photo beside the first. Also found dead in Mr. Buck's apartment in 2019. Another methamphetamine overdose. He looked up from the photos, his eyes burning with a righteous fire as he stared directly at Schiff. "And you knew. The whole Democratic establishment in California knew he was a predator. His activities were an open secret. But the money was good, wasn't it, Congressman?" The checks kept clearing. He then clicked a remote. And the large screens in the hearing room, which had previously shown documents, now displayed a video. It was a middle-aged black woman, her face a mask of grief, tears streaming down her cheeks. "My name is Letitia Nixon," the woman said, her voice cracking with pain. "My son, Gemmill Moore, was killed by Ed Buck. Adam Schiff knew Ed Buck was dangerous. They all knew, but they kept taking his money. They kept protecting him. My son is dead because politicians like Adam Schiff cared more about their campaign donations than they did about black lives." The room was utterly, devastatingly silent. Even Schiff's remaining lawyer had stopped whispering. The raw, human pain on the screen had transcended the political theater. Did those young men's lives matter less than Ed Buck's money? "Congressman?" Kennedy asked quietly, his voice resonating with the mother's grief. "Because from where I'm sitting, it sure looks that way." Schiff finally found his voice. A weak, desperate croak. "I returned those donations as soon as the gravity of the situation became clear." "Did you now?" Kennedy interrupted, his voice like the crack of a whip. He produced a stack of official Federal Election Commission records and slammed them on the desk. "Because according to these official, legally binding filings, you never returned a single dime. Not one red cent, even after the first death. Even after the second death. Ed Buck's money stayed right there in your campaign account." He looked up, his face a mask of undisguised contempt. "Your pants are on fire, Congressman, and that's not one of my Louisiana sayings. That is just a cold, hard fact." He let the FEC records sit there. A monument to Schiff's greed and mendacity. "You've got blood on your hands," Kennedy said softly. "Maybe not legally, that's for a jury to decide. But morally, ethically, you are as guilty as sin on a Sunday." The air in the room was thick with the moral filth of the Ed Buck scandal. But Kennedy was not finished draining the cesspool. He reached for the next folder. Its title promising another journey into the abyss, Chinese Connections. "Speaking of choosing money over country," Kennedy said, seamlessly transitioning from domestic depravity to international compromise. Let's talk about China, because if you thought Ed Buck was bad, wait until you meet who else has been funding your career. He adjusted his glasses with theatrical precision. Now, before we dive into this one, I need to establish something. You and your California colleague on the Intelligence Committee, Congressman Eric Swalwell, y'all are like two peas in a pod. Except, Kennedy's lips curled into a slight, cutting smile. Eric got honey potted by a Chinese spy. And you? Well, it looks like you just got money potted. He opened the folder, revealing a complex financial chart that looked like an intricate spiderweb. Let's start with your donor list. It's amazing how many of your top contributors have direct, verifiable ties to the Chinese Communist Party. It's like a who's who of Beijing's influence operations in America. He began pointing to names on the chart. James Chong donated $58 to your various campaigns. Also happens to sit on the board of 3 corporations directly owned by the Chinese government. Linda Wu, a very generous $75 in donations. Her husband runs the entire U.S. branch of the state-owned China Construction Bank. Shall I continue? Because the list is very, very long. Schiff's remaining lawyer was scribbling furiously. But it was like trying to catch a waterfall in a teacup. But here's where it gets really, truly interesting, Kennedy said, leaning forward as if sharing a grand secret. Then, without any warning, he switched languages. Ni nen ting dong wo de wa ma, yi yuan? Ni nen ting dong wo de wa ma, yi yuan? Kennedy asked, his pronunciation of Mandarin Chinese crisp and perfect. The question translated to, can you understand what I am saying, Congressman? The hearing room was stunned into absolute silence. The sheer, unexpected shock of a Louisiana senator speaking fluent Mandarin was total. Every eye in the room swiveled to Adam Schiff. And in that moment of pure, unscripted shock, Schiff's carefully constructed composure shattered. He made a fatal, involuntary mistake. His mouth opened, and the beginning of a response in the same language, a simple, whoa, for, I, escaped his lips before his conscious brain could slam the brakes. He froze, his mouth half open, a look of pure, unadulterated horror on his face. He had been exposed. Kennedy switched back to English, his Louisiana drawl now sounding more pronounced than ever. Well now, that's a very interesting language skill you have there, Congressman, he observed, his voice dripping with faux innocence. Where exactly did you learn to speak such fluent Mandarin? And more importantly, why did you instinctively understand my question about your Chinese handlers? The press section exploded. It was the sound of 100 stories being simultaneously rewritten. This was the moment. This was the kill shot that would lead every news broadcast in the world. Kennedy, however, held up a hand for silence. But wait, he announced with a showman's flair. It gets even better. He pulled out his phone. Let's see what Chinese state-run media is saying about this hearing right now. He tapped the screen. Oh, would you look at this? An article, published in the People's Daily just 47 minutes ago, during this hearing. He read from his phone, his voice filled with mock admiration. Brave Congressman Schiff defends China's interests against racist, imperialist attacks. It seems they're watching this hearing live in Beijing and cheering you on in real time. You're their MVP. Congressman, their most valuable puppet. The image of Schiff as Beijing's most valuable puppet was now seared into the minds of everyone watching. Kennedy pressed his advantage, transforming the shocking revelation into a cascade of irrefutable financial evidence. He produced bank records and timelines, painting a damning picture not just of influence, but of a direct quid pro quo. Coincidences are funny things, aren't they? Kennedy mused, displaying a large chart that correlated Schiff's voting record with financial transactions. Let's look at the pattern. March 12, 2019. You vote against a bill that would have sanctioned Chinese officials for their genocide against the Uyghur people. March 20, 2019. Just 8 days later, a shell corporation, later traced back to a CCP-linked businessman, makes a $25 deposit into a consulting firm owned by your wife. A coincidence? He pointed to another date. June 5, 2019. As chairman, you use your power to kill a bipartisan bill in committee that would have fast-tracked arms sales to Taiwan. June 15, 10 days later, you receive a $40 speaking fee from a pro-Beijing, Chinese-American friendship organization that the FBI has identified as a front for Chinese intelligence. Another coincidence. Every time you voted against sanctions on China, a deposit. Every time you killed legislation critical of Beijing, a deposit. Every time you publicly defended Chinese trade practices, a deposit. Kennedy recited, his voice a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of accusation. Sir, you're more reliable than a Swiss watch. If Swiss watches were owned and operated by the Chinese Communist Party. Schiff, looking utterly broken, protested weakly. Those are just coincidences. Kennedy laughed, a short, sharp bark that held no humor. Son, if these are coincidences, then I'm the Emperor of China. The only thing coincidental here is how every single time you vote in a way that benefits the CCP, you and your family coincidentally get richer. He then pulled out declassified intelligence assessments. According to FBI counterintelligence, he read, Chinese state media has mentioned you favorably 847 times in the last 5 years. By contrast, they have mentioned me exactly 0 times. Unless you count the articles calling me a warmongering pig. I wonder why that is. Could it be because I don't vote the way Beijing wants me to? Finally, Kennedy produced the most chilling piece of evidence from the China folder. Here's the most damning part. This is your personal investment portfolio. Obtained via subpoena. It shows that on 3 separate occasions, within 48 hours of receiving a top-secret, classified briefing on emerging Chinese military threats to the United States, your broker executed purchases of stocks in the very Chinese companies developing that military technology. He let the accusation hang in the air. It's treasonous weight silencing the room. You literally bet against America. You used our nation's most sensitive secrets to place a financial wager on the success of our primary adversary. That's not just wrong. That's not just corrupt. That, sir, is borderline treasonous. The word, treasonous, echoed in the chamber. Kennedy closed the China folder with finality. You know what really burns my grits? He said, his voice rising with genuine, unfeigned anger. American factories have closed because of China. American jobs have been lost because of China. American technology has been stolen by China. And through it all, Adam Schiff got richer while American workers got poorer. You sold out the working families of this country for a pocketful of Chinese cash. You're supposed to represent California, not Beijing, but I guess it's hard to tell the difference when you're cashing checks from both. With the specter of treason hanging over Schiff, Kennedy pivoted to the final pillar of his alleged corruption, his incestuous relationship with the media. He reached for the next folder, labeled Media Manipulation. Speaking of selling out, Kennedy began, settling back into his storyteller mode. Let's talk about how you've corrupted the free press. Because a congressman who lies is bad enough. But a congressman who recruits the media to knowingly spread his lies for him. That's a whole different level of swamp creature. He opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers that must have been 6 inches thick. My uncle Boudreaux had an old boat that leaked something terrible. He drawled, no matter how much we patched it. Water just kept coming in. Well, Uncle Boudreaux's boat was more watertight than your office when it comes to leaking classified information to the press. He held up the stack. By my count, and I had 3 separate analysts verify this, your office was the source of 438 unauthorized leaks of classified or sensitive information to the media. 438. That's more leaks than my Uncle Bobby's fishing boat. And that thing sank in Lake Pontchartrain. He began laying out the evidence. Timelines showing a reporter from a major newspaper tweeting out the substance of a classified briefing just minutes after it concluded. Phone records linking Schiff's senior staff to the journalists who broke the biggest bombshells of the Russia probe. Sworn affidavits from other committee members who witnessed the coordination firsthand. But these weren't just random leaks. Kennedy argued, they were strategically timed, carefully curated, and surgically deployed to inflict maximum political damage. You turned the solemn business of intelligence into entertainment. You turned classification into clickbait. He then pulled out screenshots of text messages and emails between his staff and prominent journalists, showing them collaborating on talking points. But the crown jewel was a hot mic recording. We have here a moment from your appearance on MSNBC. Kennedy announced. Where you thought your microphone was off during a commercial break. He played the audio. Schiff's voice was clear. Make sure Jake gets the 3 talking points for his show tonight. The recording of Schiff said. Tapper needs to hit them hard. So you see, you're not just leaking to the media. Kennedy observed. You're directing them. You're a conductor leading an orchestra. Except the music you're making is the sound of journalism dying. He then turned to financial records. But it's not just about controlling the narrative. It's about profit. He displayed the numbers on the screen. Speaking fees from media companies who employ the very journalists you leak to. $1.2 million over 5 years. Paid contributor contracts for your wife's consulting firm from media-adjacent entities. Another $800. Lucrative book deals with publishing houses owned by the same media conglomerates. $3 million. He shook his head in mock admiration. You turned your oversight duties into a profit center. P.T. Barnum would be proud. He looked directly at the press section, many of whom now looked profoundly uncomfortable. And y'all in the media, he said, his voice softening slightly. Some of you were willing accomplices. Some of you were just victims. But every last one of you got played by a man who views truth as optional and facts as flexible. Thomas Jefferson said he'd prefer newspapers without a government to a government without newspapers. But he assumed those newspapers would be telling the truth, not just taking dictation from Adam Schiff. He closed the media folder with disgust. The First Amendment guarantees a free press because our democracy depends on it. You took that sacred institution and turned it into your personal propaganda machine. That's not just a corruption of Congress. That's a corruption of democracy itself. The hearing room had become a tomb. The air was heavy, not with tension, but with the suffocating weight of established guilt. Adam Schiff sat slumped in his chair. A hollowed-out man, his expensive suit now looking like a funeral shroud. His team of 5 lawyers had dwindled to one nervous junior attorney who looked like he wished the earth would swallow him whole. Kennedy reached for the final, slender folder. This was not about a new crime, but about the wages of all the sins that had been exposed. You know, Congressman, Kennedy said, his voice now quiet and somber. We've covered a lot of ground today. Russia lies, whistleblower coaching, donor scandals, Chinese money, media manipulation, impeachment games. That's quite a career you've built. It's like a house of cards. Impressive to look at from a distance. But one single breath of truth, and the whole thing comes tumbling down. He pulled out a single document from the folder. This here is interesting. It's your personal financial disclosure from 2015. The year before the Trump-Russia saga began. Your net worth was approximately $500. Not bad for a public servant. He then placed another document beside it. And here is your most recent disclosure from 2023. Your net worth is now approximately $4.5 million. That's an 800% increase in 8 years. He laid out year-by-year financial records, creating a damning timeline of enrichment. Every scandal we've discussed today made you richer. Every lie you told paid a dividend. Every betrayal of the public trust came with a bonus. You're a corruption capitalist. You found a way to monetize malfeasance. It was at this moment that something utterly unprecedented happened. Schiff's chief counsel, the one who had quietly returned during a break, abruptly stood up. Mr. Chairman, he announced, his voice shaking with either fear or conviction. I must state for the record that, effective immediately, I can no longer represent Congressman Schiff in this matter. My ethical obligations as an officer of the court prevent me from continuing. Without another word, he gathered his papers and walked out of the hearing room, abandoning his client on live television. Well, Kennedy drawled into the stunned silence. When the rats start leaving the ship, you know it's sinking. Schiff's remaining composure finally cracked. This is a setup, he shrieked, his voice cracking. A political hit job. This is Trump's revenge. This is consequences. Congressman, Kennedy interrupted, his voice calm and steady. It's a concept you've managed to avoid your entire career. But like my grandpappy used to say, the chickens always come home to roost. And sir, your whole farm just showed up. Then, another shockwave hit. A senior Democratic congresswoman from California, a longtime colleague of Schiff's, stood up. Mr. Chairman, she said, her voice trembling but clear. I cannot sit here silently any longer. I'm from California. I've watched Adam operate for years. Senator Kennedy is right. Our leadership, myself included, has enabled this corruption through our silence. And I can no longer be complicit. The defection from his own party, his own state, seemed to break the last thread holding Schiff together. His hands were shaking so violently that he knocked over his glass of water. "We're not quite done," Kennedy said, pulling one final set of documents from the folder. "These are the criminal referrals that I will be submitting to the Department of Justice immediately following this hearing. Allow me to read the proposed charges." He put on his reading glasses with theatrical precision. "Perjury, 17 counts, for every time you lied to Congress under oath. Leaking classified information, 23 counts. Obstruction of justice, 11 counts. For hiding evidence and witness tampering. RICO violations, 7 counts. For running what amounts to a criminal enterprise from your congressional office. Wire fraud, 9 counts. Related to those Chinese wire transfers. Campaign finance violations, 31 counts." The list went on. A brutal, systematic catalog of felony charges. Each one backed by the evidence Kennedy had presented. That's 98 federal charges in total. "Congressman, in Louisiana, we'd say you're in more trouble than a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs." Kennedy stood up, gathering his folders. "You had potential," he said, looking at Schiff with something resembling pity. "But you chose lies over truth, power over principle, and profit over people." He delivered his final blow with devastating Southern politeness. "Bless your heart, Congressman Schiff. And when you're sitting in federal prison, and you will be, maybe you'll finally have time to reread that ethics thesis you wrote at Harvard." The sound of the chairman's gavel was like a final nail in the coffin of Adam Schiff's career. What followed was not a slow decline but a spectacular, immediate collapse. Kennedy's criminal referrals, backed by the mountain of public evidence, were impossible for the Department of Justice to ignore. 2 weeks after the hearing, Adam Schiff was arrested. The trial was swift. The evidence, the bank records, the video testimonies, the declassified intelligence, was overwhelming. He was convicted on 47 of the most serious federal charges and sentenced to 25 years in a federal penitentiary. But the hearing had ignited a firestorm that went far beyond one corrupt congressman. The Kennedy Standard, as it became known, triggered a wave of accountability that swept through Washington. 19 other members of Congress and dozens of high-level staffers were indicted in the leak and influence peddling investigations that followed. Major media figures were fired, and news organizations were forced into a painful public reckoning over their complicity, leading to new, stricter ethical guidelines. The secret basement SCIF was permanently barred from being used for any purpose other than its original intelligence briefing intent. The era of the show trial was over. Senator John Kennedy returned to Louisiana not as a politician, but as a conquering hero. Yet, true to his nature, he deflected the praise with his characteristic humility. "I just did my job," he told a crowd at the Baton Rouge airport. "The truth did all the heavy lifting. I just organized it into folders." His simple country lawyer persona was now understood for what it was. A brilliant strategic tool that had disarmed his opponent and allowed the truth to speak for itself. Years later, political historians would mark the Kennedy-Schiff hearing as a pivotal turning point in American history. It was the moment when performative, partisan outrage collided with authentic, evidence-based accountability, and accountability won. It became a case study in law schools and ethics courses on how one prepared individual, armed with the truth, could dismantle an entire edifice of corruption. In federal prison, Schiff was reportedly assigned to the law library, where guards said he spent his days obsessively reading and rereading his old Harvard thesis on prosecutorial ethics. The other inmates, with their own particular brand of justice, had a nickname for him, Pinocchio. Back in Washington, Kennedy's influence grew, but he never changed. He was still the man with the slow drawl, the folksy sayings, and the battered leather briefcase. He had proven that wisdom was more powerful than cleverness, that truth was more devastating than lies, and that authentic public service would, in the end, triumph over cynical corruption. He had reminded America that sometimes, the good guys do win. They just do it with a drawl, a pile of evidence, and a final, devastating, "bless your heart."